Hi, I'm Savita and welcome to my online sewing class. This class is not about how to make a garment. I've been receiving a lot of messages asking what is the cutting table I use for cutting the fabrics. In this class, I'll show you how to easily make your own fabric covered cutting table, which is very convenient for cutting the fabrics. And also in this class, I'll be sharing a few sewing tips useful for absolute beginners in sewing. So let's start. This is my fabric covered tabletop, which I normally use for cutting the fabric. Sometimes I also use this self-healing cutting mat. It is very easy to cut the fabric using the cutting mat and the rotary cutter. The rotary cutter can be used only along with the cutting mat. For example, when there's curves like armholes or necklines, if you're finding it difficult to cut with the shears, it's very easy to cut with the rotary cutter. You cannot use this rotary cutter directly on the fabric covered table because it would cut the fabric on the table as well. So when you're using this rotary cutter, you need to have a self-healing cutting mat. Also, it's ideal to use the self-healing cutting mat and rotary cutter when you're working with soft fabrics and you have to cut multiple layers of fabric. When working with soft fabrics and cutting multiple layers, if you lift the fabric to cut with the shears, without your knowledge, the inside layer may not be aligned together. So it's ideal to cut with a rotary cutter as you just need to hold all the layers firm and cut as per the marking. So I use the rotary cutter and the cutting mat sometimes, and other times I use my fabric covered tabletop. Now let me show you how to easily make this fabric covered tabletop, which is very convenient to cut the fabrics. I'll be demonstrating on a small piece of wood. First of all, you would need to buy a plywood as per your requirement. That is, you can get the plywood cut to the size of 3 by 4 feet or 4 by 4 feet. This is just an example, and also this wood available in different thickness. This is 1 inch thick. This would not bend over the time. However, you get it thinner also, and there are different qualities of wood available. This is neem wood, which avoids termites. So first of all, buy a plywood to the size that you need, and then measure the length and width and add a few inches on all sides, and that would be your fabric requirement. The fabric I have used to cover the wood is high heat resistant fabric. That is, it has a velvet finish on one side and a cotton finish on the other. However, it's not a must to use such fabric. You can also use any thick cotton fabric. I use this fabric because it's high heat resistant, and when we iron, it does not get burnt. So the fabric should be long and wide enough to be able to tuck under the wooden piece. Once you have the wood and fabric, lay the fabric on the plywood and turn it to the other side. Or you can lay the fabric first and place the wood on top of the fabric. Now take drawing pins. Now you'll need to fold over the fabric and pin the fabric to the wood using drawing pins. Just press the pin through the fabric and use a hammer to hammer it down. I do not have a hammer here. I'll just use this to demonstrate. So this way you will pin the fabric to the wood all around. This wood may cost you around 1000 rupees to 2000 depending on the dimensions and the thickness you select. This fabric costs around approximately 400 per meter, but you can use any other fabric. So this way you'll be pinning it, and in the corners just fold it over and pin the layers together. In the corners you can put 2 pins to hold it together. So pin all around. And when you fold the fabric over, make sure it's nicely pulled and tight so that you don't have looseness on the other side. I pinned all around and this is the last one. I'm placing it on this mat because the table is also white and it may not be clearly visible. So that's all you need to do. Now you can place this wood on any table for cutting your fabric, or you can also place it on the floor and cut the fabric. Cutting fabric on this board is so much more convenient because you can pin the fabric and the pattern directly onto the fabric on the board. For example, if this is the fabric you're cutting and if this is your pattern, you can place the pattern on the fabric and pin it directly to the table fabric. So it's easier to pin. And also when you use the tracing wheel on the marks to transfer it to the fabric, it's much easier to trace than when you place the fabric directly on a wood or any other surface. So this is how you do the fabric covered cutting table. After you cut the fabric, there might be some loose threads or fabric pieces which might be difficult to clean because there is fabric here. You can just use a cleaning brush and you can easily clean the table. Next tip is about marking and cutting the fabric. Now suppose this is your fabric and this is your pattern. Before laying the pattern on the fabric, always iron the fabric and remove all the creases. Pin the pattern in place. Before marking the outline or the seam allowance with the marking chalk, make sure the edges of the marking chalk is sharp so that you get neat lines. Over the use, the edges may become blunt. A simple way to sharpen it is with a scissor or a knife. You can just sharpen the edges. In this way you can get sharp and neat lines. When you're adding seam allowance on the fabric, make sure you're adding the seam allowance as much as you would be taking while sewing. Do not add extra or less, and make sure you'll be taking the same seam allowance while sewing. These are small tips but very important to get a perfect fit in the garment. Once you've marked the seam allowance, while cutting, use good quality shears as they will last long and also make cutting easier. When you hold the shears, do not hold it slant as you may cut a little inner than the marking that you have made. Always hold the shears straight. And as you cut, look at the next point where you need to cut. So the shears will automatically go to that place. And with your left hand, firmly hold the fabric layers together. Open the scissors and then move it and close it. In the curves, learn to turn your wrists to cut on the marked line. Especially in the armhole and neckline. Make the notches at the right places. Till you're ready to sew the garment, keep it rolled so that the fabric does not fray much. Now I'll share some tips for absolute beginners in sewing. In this class 2 of our anarkali kameez course, learn to make casual wear circular cut anarkali kameez or dress. As we'll be giving darts in this garment for comfort of wearing and for good fit, before watching this class, you need to have watched our class on how to give darts in a garment. In this class, you will also learn sewing concealed zipper in the side seam, a different neckline, and different ways of finishing the hemline. We will guide you in learning to make this dress from start to finish. So join savisfashionstudio.com to start sewing, and happy sewing. Before starting with your sewing, always make it a habit to clean the surface of the table. This is because there could be some oil or dust on the table, and when you sew the actual garment, it can stain your fabric, especially when you're using a light colored fabric. So make it a point to clean the surface of the sewing table before you actually start sewing the garment. And before you actually start sewing the garment, always sew on a scrap piece of fabric. This is to check that the stitch quality is good. If you get loops or if the stitches are loose, then you would need to make the adjustments and then take out your actual garment to be stitched. Another tip is, while sewing, instead of keeping your fabric shears with you on the sewing table, use a small trimmer. This is for different reasons. One being, the fabric shears can fall as you sew and it may hurt you. Another reason is fabric shears being heavy. As you keep it on the table and move it around, it can chip off the table surface or spoil the table surface. So it's always better to keep the small trimmer with you while sewing. The next tip is, always try to use exactly matching thread, unless of course you intentionally want to use a contrast thread. Now I'm using a contrast thread so that the stitches are clearly visible to you. And ensure your machine is always well lubricated. That is, oil the machine regularly if you are using a manual pedal machine. Depending on the fabric that you're using and the thread you're using, you would need to adjust the tension on the machine. So first you would need to do a stitch and see if there is any need for any adjustments. And the basic tips before starting to sew is, keep your fingers away from the needle and be attentive while sewing. If you're distracted, you may hurt yourself. After you do a trial stitch, just see on both the sides. You should not have any loops or there should not be any looseness. And if the stitch length is too big, you can reduce the stitch length or increase it as per your requirement. The normal stitch length we keep is between 2 and 3. If you are making a temporary stitch, that is a basting stitch, then you can keep the stitch length between 4 and 5. Now this stitch is fine. Let me try to intentionally make it wrong and show you how to correct it. Now actually, as per this stitch, the tension is perfect, but I'll purposely loosen it and show you what difference it will make while sewing. Now this is the stitch I made. I decreased the tension, that is loosened the tension disc, and see here on the back side I'm getting loops. When you get such loops or looseness in the stitch on the lower side, then you know you need to adjust the tension, that is tighten the tension. You may need to do a little trial and error before you get the perfect stitch. Adjust the tension and check again if the stitch is fine. Now the stitch is fine, there are no loops here. It would be the same whether you are using a manual pedal machine or electric home sewing machine. You will need to adjust the tension according to the thickness of the fabric and the thread that you use. Now if there is some problem with the bobbin case or in the thread winding in the bobbin, then it can cause looseness in the upper stitch. Now I'll show you another stitch and explain what the problem is. Now if you see the stitch, there is looseness on top. That is, top stitch is not okay, but the lower stitch is fine. If the top stitch is not fine, that means there is some problem with the bobbin case or the bobbin. This could happen if the winding of thread in the bobbin is loose. In that case, you would need to rewind it. Now another reason for the looseness of thread on top stitch is, over the usage, the screws in the bobbin case may loosen, and that could be the reason which is causing the looseness in the top stitch. Now when I put this thread in and bring it here and I pull it, this comes very fast. Now, in that case, what you need to do is take a small screwdriver and tighten the screws here, the small screws that you see here. If you see here, there is some looseness, and that has caused the stitch to be loose. Do not make it too tight. Also this small screw. Now this seems to be fine. This tension seems to be fine. It should neither be too tight or too loose. Now let's see how the stitch comes. You see the stitch has become perfect compared to the previous one where it was loose. So if you see that the stitch on top is loose, always check your bobbin case and the bobbin, or you can also try replacing the bobbin case and try if the stitches come fine. And if you see that the understitch has looseness, then adjust the tension. That should solve the problem. If you are a beginner in sewing, focus more on neatness of work rather than speed of sewing, because the speed can increase as you practice. The neatness becomes a habit if you start it from the beginning. And when you go wrong somewhere, do not hesitate to remove the stitch. Do not compromise. Remove the stitches and redo it again. That way you will learn better. You can use this tool called seam ripper for removing the stitches easily. Always keep your sewing tools and accessories organized so that you don't waste time looking for your tools. I use this box to keep my things organized. This box has spool holders which keeps my threads neat and tidy. And this is the cord piping thread. When it is all in one place, it's easy to find whatever you want, and also you don't end up wasting time looking for something. As you sew, if the thread keeps coming off or if the thread breaks, then check the position of the needle here. Slight variation in the alignment can cause this problem. Then you'll need to correct it. And also the thread can break if the tension is too tight. And as you sew, if you see that the thread in the fabric is getting pulled, then check the tip of the needle. It could be because the tip of the needle is bent, and in that case you will need to replace the needle. And for good quality stitches, before any important project, change the needle, as it will be more sharper and the stitching will be nicer. Thanks for watching this class. All the sewing tools and pattern making tools that we use in our classes are available on our website, and the link is given below. See you soon in the next class. Until then, happy sewing.